Welcome. I'm Gabriel Gaster of the Platypus Affiliated Society. So the point of this event is to help clarify thinking on what can be done to transform the Israel-Palestine impasse and emancipate the Palestinians. To that end, we're joined tonight by two of the most outspoken intellectuals, each proposing strategies that are in stark opposition. Hussein Ibish is a two-stater, senior fellow of the American Task Force on Palestine, and has co-written a brief on the right of return with Ali Abu-Nima and written for the Washington Post and several newspapers. He's debated the head of Islamic Jihad Gaza and recently written What's Wrong with the One-State Agenda, available for free online. His blog is ibishblog.com. Joel Kovel is a professor emeritus of social studies at Bard College, editor-in-chief of Capitalism, Nature, Socialism, a scholarly international journal of eco-socialism and ecofeminism, and author of several books, including History and Spirit and The Enemy of Nature. He will discuss his most recent book, Overcoming Zionism, Creating a Single Democratic State in Israel-Palestine. His website is joelkovel.org. And moderating this discussion is Richard Rubin of the Platypus Affiliated Society.
Okay, I'm just going to explain the basic format. This is not a formal debate, it's a discussion. And I have prepared a list of questions. I've written them on my hand.
You couldn't afford a teleprompter, eh?
Well, anyway, actually I'm more conventional than Sarah Palin. So anyway, I'm going to try to get through the questions, but I'm not going to stick rigidly to them, and depending upon how the conversation goes, we can deviate. And then after we've gone through the discussion for a while, it'll be opened up to questions for the floor. Okay, the first question, addressed to both of you, is many people would question whether this conversation should be held at all. They feel that the focus should be on Israel's violation of Palestinian human rights, and that raising the question of whether one should strive for one state or two is at best a distraction, and at worst divisive, since it highlights internal Palestinian divisions. So why then, from the standpoint of both of you, is this an important conversation to have?
How do you want to
I'll defer to you.
Okay, you can
I'll start.
Sure.
Sorry.
Well, obviously one doesn't want to overstate the importance of this issue, but it is essential to keep it in mind, because otherwise you're caught up in the old trap of just dealing with symptoms and not, underlying processes. The Israeli occupation follows from certain fundamental assumptions. It is not accidental. It's not random. It's not arbitrary. It has a lawfulness and a structure and a law of motion that can only be discerned if you take into account the entire history and pattern, worth and outcome of the Israeli state. And so it's a question of giving perspective, really. You won't get decent perspective unless you are willing to commit yourself to certain ends and to take the means that are consonant with those ends. So I'll leave it at this point, because there's a lot more to be said about that, and I'll turn it over to Hussein.
Thanks very much. First of all, let me say thank you very much for hosting this
Yes.
Platypus Review of BA. Well done, and
Yes.
and thank you very much, Dr. Kovel, for agreeing to be here. That's a great thing, and thank you to everybody for coming. It's an excellent opening question. Well, first of all, it's necessary to have a conversation generally about national strategy if you are involved in the question of Palestinian national liberation, as I have been for a couple of decades now. If you're going to have a political program which is going to be effective, I think you absolutely have to have a clear and well-defined goal, because without that you can't have a coherent strategy. And without a coherent strategy, you can't have effective tactics. Otherwise, things are going to be wild, random, ad hoc, and whatever victories or momentum comes out of them will be lost into the ether. I think without a clear goal, a political movement is sunk from the outset. So obviously what the goal is a crucial question. Now, for a long time among Palestinians and their allies, there wasn't much of a debate. Right? Initially, following the reconstruction of the Palestinian national movement in the mid-60s after the Nakba, the destruction of all Palestinian society and Palestinian national institutions, the goal was defined as the replacement of Israel by a single democratic state, but one that would be Arab in character. If you read the PLO charters of 64 and 68, there's no question that what they're talking about is an ethnically Arab state. They're very, very clear about that. It's also going to be a secular state, a democratic state. There's a difference of opinion in the two charters about the role of a Jewish minority, but nonetheless, the idea is clear. This is an Arab state. Palestine will be restored as an Arab state. In the early 70s to mid-70s, it became very clear, I think, to the Palestinian National Movement that the approach based on the two charters was not going to work. That, in other words, the emphasis on armed struggle was pointless because armed struggle was not going to produce victory. And liberation was going to be achieved through political means, not through military means. And the other was that this goal of reversing the consequences of the 1948 war and eliminating Israel and replacing it with a restored Arab Palestine with a Jewish minority or a Jewish presence, but not national project, was also implausible and an ineffective goal because not achievable. And by the late 80s, the Palestinian National Movement changed its focus formally, and the PLO adopted the two-state agenda as its formal goal, and through a series of resolutions, and it's been that way ever since. There's been there has been an emergence of a challenge since the Second Intifada. Just let me explain this. I'm sorry to take long, but inside Palestine, the challenge has come from a thriving Islamist movement, which holds that the goal is the creation of an Islamic state, not an Arab state or a Jewish state or a democratic state, but an Islamic state between the river and the sea. And in Palestine right now, there is a pitched battle for national authority between secular nationalists of the PLO who stick with the two-state idea and Islamists led by Hamas who want an Islamic state from the river to the sea. There is a second challenge that has arisen largely in the diaspora, mainly on university campuses in the US and the UK, and that's the one-state agenda among Palestinians. Now, Professor Kovel represents, I think, a somewhat different strand of this, which is a strand of this based on an internal Jewish critique of Zionism. And it's very interesting. In my book on the one-state agenda, I didn't really deal with that. I was talking about the challenge from within the Palestinian and pro-Palestinian, that is to say Arab American, really, and their allies, supporters, people who have reacted to the violence of the Second Intifada, the failure of the peace process, the frustration and the anger, the same symptoms that led Israeli society to turn radically to the right, and in the occupied territories facilitated the rise of Hamas. In the diaspora has produced this one-state discourse. I have an elaborate argument about why I think it's misguided and mistaken. I've written this 150-page book about it that you can get online, and I'm sure we'll get into a lot of the arguments. But that's why we need to address it. You know?
Okay, many organizations that deal with this issue don't take a position on one state or two, and that's a deliberate strategy. Now, there are, of course, some organizations that are explicitly anti-Zionist that call for one state. They're a very small minority, and there are some that are explicitly two-state. Why is it important, if you think it's important, for organizations to take an explicit stand? Why is not taking a stand inadequate? Or is it a good idea not to take a stand?
I'll begin this one. We can alternate. We can alternate.
Absolutely.
I mean, I think clearly it's important. The organizations that won't take a stand on this, you know, for example, the U.S. Campaign to End the Occupation. Right?
Yes.
It's an excellent organization, right? And they say they're agnostic. Phyllis Bennis and Nadia Hijab and the rest of them, excellent people who do sterling work. And they won't take a position on this. And I think the reason is so as not to alienate any potential activists. In other words, there's a coherent rationale for this. But the effect of it has to be recognized. It means that organizations who do that can't have any serious policy role. In other words, they will not have a direct political effect. At best, they will only have an indirect political effect because they're limiting their work to public education. Right? That's it. Let me just do a little scenario. If you're interested in affecting U.S. policy now in the Obama administration, rather than changing attitudes in the next 50 years among the general public in the United States, those are two different goals. I'm interested in policy now. Right? I don't have 50 years. I don't have 5 years. I mean, now there's a fierce urgency about this situation. Let me do a little thought experiment with you. You're representing an organization that doesn't really take a position, one state, two state, and you go to see a senior legislative aide in the office of your member of Congress. And they say to you, okay, we have 2 minutes. You represent this organization. Middle East, what do you want? What is your end? What's your policy goal? What do you want? And you go, well, you see, that doesn't work. Okay, it just doesn't work. So honestly, if you're happy just doing public education and raising awareness about the evils of Israeli policy and the evils of the occupation, there's no problem with that. If you have a broader ambition, a political ambition, an ambition that belongs to the category of the political as such, then it's really not good enough at all.
Okay. Joe, would you like to respond
yes,
to that?
I think that there's a distinction between Hussein and myself, which is very useful to keep in mind, and that has to do with perspective. And he's talking about, sort of the basis of his own work, which is to be in Washington, to work with policy, to think as a realistic possibility that you'll be sitting in a congressman's office. Now, I've sat in my congressman's office, but I've sat in my congressman's office. I refuse to leave it. That sort of. My view is, and I think what he's saying is necessary, but it's very much not sufficient. Mm-hmm. And
I agree with that.
I have a perspective which is longer range, also necessary, also not sufficient. Mm-hmm. Now, the perspective I have is basically the perspective, the title of my book is Overcoming Zionism. And then the subtitle of the book is Creating a Single Democratic State in Israel-Palestine. I kind of wish I could, I'm doing a second edition, by the way, and it's going to be Palestine-Israel in the second edition, because that was a mistake. But for me, the important thing is to do whatever we can do to put the notion of Zionism in the dustbin of history, with the divine right of kings. I see it as an aberration that took place in the late history of not all Jews, but Jews of a certain class and location and all that. We can get into the detail. And that has had very baleful and bad consequences. I don't think the world, certainly not that part of the world, can be in any sense healed or a better place unless Zionism is brought down. And Zionism is an idea, so and requires, however, institutional perspectives. I don't think, for instance, and the core of my opposition, for instance, to two-state, is twofold. One is, does it provide Palestinians with genuine sovereignty, genuine control over their own lives, or does it make for a Bantustan? But this one last point.
I just want to clarify something.
Yeah, and the other is, does it permit the perpetuation of Israel as a Zionist entity? And if it permits the perpetuation of Israel as a Zionist entity, then I will fight it.
But just to clarify what you're saying, Joel, so you're saying that if a two-state solution of the conventional variety were possible, right, which would leave Israel as a Zionist entity, mm-hmm, you would politically oppose that.
Correct.
So then it seems to me you're saying something different from saying that Hussein's work is necessary, because Hussein is working towards that goal. I don't understand how.
Well, I haven't heard yet what Hussein's.
Oh, I am working towards that goal, ending the occupation. I want to end the occupation yesterday.
Then Hussein and I have more than just a strategic, but also a substantive difference.
Yeah,
but
we
can elaborate on that. Okay. I don't want the struggle that's being played out in this racked, overwrought part of the world to end up in raising the level of what South Africa had in its apartheid era. You have to realize that we don't have the true apartheid situation there. They will have that when they get their Bantustans. And if the Palestinian state is a Bantustan, then to me that's not a worthy...
Well, of course, I agree. I'm not working for a Bantustan. I completely agree with that. And I think there is no group of serious Palestinians who are interested in the box that a state came in and the trappings of sovereignty without sovereignty. I don't know of them. They'd never agreed to anything like that as a permanent agreement. What exists now is a temporary agreement, and they're not satisfied with it, and they're not signing about it. So I agree with you on that.
Well, if I may skip ahead, because we're sort of addressing these questions, but somewhat different order.
Sure.
So there seem to be two sets of interlocking anxieties about the two-state solution. On the Israeli side, there's an oft-expressed fear that a Palestinian state would be a base for attacks against Israel. This Israeli fear would seem to be reinforced by a Palestinian discourse that sometimes speaks of liberation in stages. On the Palestinian side, however, there's a fear that a Palestinian state would be a kleptocracy that would steal from its citizens with no real sovereignty, and that it would be a collaborator state that would in effect administer the occupation under the facade of an internationally recognized pseudo-independence, which seemed to be Joel's point. Are either or both of these anxieties justified at all? Is there some kernel of truth?
I don't think the first anxiety is at all justified. I think that's standard Israeli, paranoid propaganda.
But do you think the second...
The second is obviously justified, and it's justified because the danger that look at the people who have signed on to the prospect of the roadmap, the two-state solution. I mean, these are people who want a Palestinian authority that will administer, the police and the garbage disposal, but have no real power.
Well, but one of those was Yasser Arafat. So you're saying the entire PLO was basically a collaborator? I mean, maybe that's true. But
I certainly think that the Oslo period, was an experiment, let's say. And I think it's an experiment that has wretchedly failed, and that we are now at the stage when we have to start rethinking things.
Well, I think that's exactly right, and I think the people who are doing the most far-reaching and effective rethinking is actually the cabinet of the PA, and particularly Salam Fayyad. I mean, the state and institution building program in order to end the occupation, the best idea anyone's had in at least 15 years, and the Israeli government, the Israeli elite they can't decide if it's interesting or terrifying or exciting or horrifying. I mean, they're just completely bamboozled by it. They have no idea how to react to it because it's so new. On the question that you pose, I don't think either of those concerns are absolutely irrational. I agree with Professor Kovel that the second one is much more closely rooted to the realities given the asymmetries of power involved. But I think that there are genuine concerns, especially among Palestinians, that, the state that they're being offered can't be a Bantustan. The Palestinian leadership has turned down Bantustan-like offers time after time after time. Yasser Arafat turned them down at Camp David. Abu Mazen turned them down from Olmert. The Palestinian negotiators turned them down at Taba. They won't accept it. And so I think the idea that this is something that they're willing to accept is disproven by their own track record. I mean, they did agree to Oslo in the expectation that after 5 years, the Israelis would have withdrawn from all parts of the occupied territories except for settlements, military bases, and Jerusalem. That was the Palestinian understanding. When I read the Oslo agreements, that seems obvious to me. Didn't happen for a complicated set of reasons. So I think these concerns are justified. And I think that there are also, by the way, would be serious fears attached to any potential one-state arrangement, if such a thing were plausibly imaginable, which it is not. And that is to say, I think under such circumstances, Palestinians might hope to exercise political power through demographics, through the ballot box, but they'd be facing a very large Jewish plurality that's much richer, much better educated, much better organized, and with much stronger national institutions. And as for Jewish Israelis, I think that, again, the anxiety would be reversed. And the question is, Do we have a discourse or a model that can prevent a single state arrangement going the way of the two models that actually exist in practice? The mandate, which was a series of increasing communal violence leading to civil war and ethnic cleansing and whatnot, and the occupation, which speaks for itself. It's nightmarish and bad for Israelis and completely unacceptable for Palestinians. So, in other words, the track record of political unity between the Israelis and the Palestinians is not really very reassuring for either party.
Well, I asked about fears about a two-state solution. So let's ask about fears about a one-state solution.
Which I started, sorry.
Well, which you started, but goes into one of my questions. So an often expressed fear relating to the one-state solution is that Israeli Jews, who would presumably be in the minority, although a very large minority, would be oppressed by Palestinian Arabs. Is there, however, reason to fear the contrary also, namely that Palestinians would be dominated by Israeli Jews who would wield superior economic and technical power?
I just said hell yes, so I'll pass.
Yeah,
and you agree?
There's no question about it. That's for sure.
So you think so then why are you advocating?
Because I think we have to be careful with not playing God here or trying to be omniscient. We're looking at a time span of 10, 20 years, and
to the achievement of the state.
whatever. Or let me put it another way. I think that the fundamental situation is internally doomed. I don't see it having much more of a life than that. It's going to change in one way or another. And however, I don't think it's going to change in any way that we can sit here godlike and say it's going to be this way and that way. I think what we have to do is try to provide the best possible circumstances for such changes as are bound to occur in a beneficial and humanly worthwhile way. And that's why I think, for me, the one-state solution is not a political program. It's what I would call a strategic goal. That is to say, I don't think any outcome will be worth anything unless it is grounded in a universal human right. And if the universal human right is incompatible with the logic and ideology of Zionism, so Zionism has to go. And it seems to me that it's going to be a very challenging, dicey situation. But I think that the momentum is already in place, that Zionism obviously is a long way from being ushered off the stage of history, but it's caught up in these internal contradictions, particularly post-Gaza, where people are panicking about its loss of legitimacy, its pariah-like status. It's now moving into the condition of South Africa in the latter part of the 80s, and so forth. So we can see a very exciting dynamic, and we have to hold before the world the hope of a genuinely better alternative grounded in universal human rights.
I think those are all very noble sentiments, and I enjoyed listening to them. But I have to say, I see it a little differently in the sense that, to me, the problem of the occupation and the imperative of ending the occupation in everybody's interest, especially the 4 million people who live under occupation in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza, shouldn't be dependent on a kind of grand elimination of Zionism. In other words, I think putting the liberation of the occupied territories on hold for this much bigger project that speaks to humanity and serves the some sort of a cosmic interest is not reasonable. I think the occupation is too onerous and too dangerous to be simply put into a bigger program. That's the first thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say is that these are very fine sentiments, but it's not, I think, accurate to say that we have no foresight into the trajectory of the future. I would argue that you can anticipate the most likely developments. And I would say that the whole structure of the question, one state or two states, is actually wrong, because it's not as if the Palestinians and the Israelis actually face this smorgasbord of options that you can pick and choose from. I think there's a fairly stark binary here. Either we have a two-state agreement which can and would end the conflict and end the occupation for now, albeit, I would agree, most imperfectly, but effectively, and it would certainly be a huge improvement, particularly for the people who live under occupation, or the likely scenario is certainly not a single-state as an outcome in the foreseeable future, it's continued warfare. And you can see the pattern that's emerged. If you compare the end of the First Intifada to the beginning of the First Intifada, and then the Second Intifada to the First Intifada, what you can see is that the conflict is becoming more militarized, more structured around organized parties that are fighting for power on both sides, especially on the Palestinian side, more violent, more fanatical, and above all, more religious. And the religious right is poised, both in Palestinian society and in Israeli society, to lead a holy war for the will of God and sacred spaces. And I really believe I don't see the social forces present that can prevent that from being the logical consequence of a continuation of this war for a couple of more decades. I really do think that's the direction in which we're going. And so, you can't, I think you have to take that into consideration as a very serious, likely scenario, absent an agreement.
Very quickly, I agree. I think the religious war is a horror that we're drifting towards. Yeah. I also want to emphasize that I by no means want to defer the ending of the occupation. And I don't think of one state, in my view, as a program along the lines of ending the occupation. I think, as I said, it's a strategic goal that embodies a universal human right, which it means, in effect, that we're totally opposed to the religious fundamentalisms that are thriving on both sides.
Okay.
May I just
interject?
Yeah,
you may,
because,
of course. You're the boss.
I mean, one of the things that I find confusing, and I've encountered this with many people. Many people will say, of course we can't defer ending the occupation, and yet they say we favor a one-state approach. It would seem to me logically, and the one person who was quite direct in his answer to this was Ali Abu Nima, that if one really adopts the slogan of a one-state solution, which Ali now says he supports, then one should drop the slogan of ending the occupation. Because it seems to me that the ending of the occupation in the way it's normally understood would tend logically to include. But I want to get you to be specific about what you mean by a two-state solution, because I think the notion of a two-state solution is rather vague.
Okay.
And the devil would appear to be in the details.
Yes.
So
I don't think it is that big, but okay.
Well,
I understand why you would think that.
Many people have quite significantly different notions of what a two-state solution is.
Yes, you're right
in
about
terms
that.
of territory. So, for example, one significant attempt to work out the details was the unofficial 2003 Geneva Initiative, which was signed by Yasser Abid-Rabou and Yossi Beilin.
Right.
Now, do you agree, first of all, that any two-state solution that would work, in your view, would look more or less like the Geneva Accord?
Yes, I think so. Something like that.
Roughly.
And by the way, let me say it was signed by Yasser Abid-Rabou and Yossi Beilin, but it was written by my colleague, the other senior fellow at ATFB, Ghaith Al-Amari, and Daniel Levy.
Right.
So it's pretty close to my heart.
Right. Okay. Now, and the other point you made in your article is you made the point that you claim that the two-state solution is the only solution compatible with international law.
At the moment, it is. It's structured into international law very deeply.
Right. And so explain what you mean by that. But the other question I wanted to address about the Geneva Initiative is, do you think that if counterfactually the Israeli government would offer something like the Geneva Initiative, that the majority of Palestinians would accept that?
There's no question about that, by the way.
Many people do question.
Well, they may, but I just consult the opinion polls. The opinion polls are very clear. The overwhelming majority of Palestinians, and actually consistently for the last at least 15 years, which is the time we've had really good opinion polling in the occupied territories. In fact, and I think you have better opinion polling.
You're talking of the work of Hallel Shikaki?
I'm talking about many different people. Shikaki is one, but there are dozens of entities. And that's the good thing, because if it was only one pollster, only one entity using only one model, that would be suspect by definition. Any given poll is kind of meaningless. The only time when polling is useful is when you have a bunch of different polls conducted by different organizations with different methodologies over a different time, yielding the same results time and again. And then you can say, all right, now we really do have a sense of where people are. It's not fanciful. Yes, I think it would. I'm really sure it would, because there is a desperate hunger on the part of the people of the occupied territories to be free.
And Joe, you would oppose the Geneva Initiative? Do you think that would constitute a Bantustan?
Tell me if I'm wrong about this, because I'm not nearly as expert as I should be on that initiative. Is it not the case that initiative did not allow for the right of return of Palestinian refugees?
It deferred the issue, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's been understood by Palestinian negotiators that the Israeli state is probably not going to agree to a mass return. So some way around that has to be
Right.
found.
Well, and at the same time, it would continue the foundational initiative in the Israeli state that the Jewish right of return would be respected.
In Israel, yes.
Yeah. No,
That's right.
I can't accept that.
Okay.
I mean, and I don't think anybody should accept that.
Well, I think that the people in the occupied territories would accept it because it has been long understood by the PLO and its negotiators that the Israelis, while the right of return has to be upheld as a principle, and Israel certainly needs to accept responsibility for the refugee situation and probably agree to some kind of a return as a recognition of that the Israeli state simply will not agree to the mass return of millions of people, and that therefore it's a deal breaker. And so the question facing the Palestinians as a matter of national strategy is it worth continuing the war and continuing the occupation to try to secure a complete realization which cannot be done in the foreseeable future, at the expense of everything else? This is one aspect of a conflict with many aspects. And the fact that one element of international law can't be realized, I don't think is an argument for not realizing a whole panoply of others. The fact that some rights cannot, as a practical matter, be achieved because a very powerful armed force will not allow it, is not a rationale for not achieving a whole bunch of others that are attainable. I think you have to bear in mind the consequences. And by the way, let me just say one other thing about the refugees. People don't recognize the benefits that a Palestinian state would have for the refugees. Yes, it doesn't solve the right of return. True. But the refugees would certainly have compensation as a result of this deal, something they don't have. Secondly, they would have a state to which they can have refuge, and for the ones in Lebanon, that can be a matter of life and death and has in the past. Third, they'll have an advocate on the international stage and a passport and a nationality for the first time. Now, none of this is a panacea. It doesn't correct the injustices of the refugees, but it's much better than nothing. And without a two-state agreement, that's what they're going to get. That's what they've had since 48, and without a two-state agreement, that's exactly what they're going to have. Nothing. Okay. And I'm not satisfied with that. When we can get them something, I want to get them something.
This is a substantive difference, and I think we should accept it as such. But
absolutely.
I just want to say that the reason this is a substantive difference on my part is because this kind of arrangement does what I said we should not do, namely preserve the basic structure of the Zionist entity in Israel. And there's one indication of what is wrong with this degree of compromise and the two-state solution, setting aside whether it's possible and all that, which is another whole argument, is it was given in the campaign last year for Prime Minister when Lipney, running on the Kadima party, said that she was for a two-state solution. It's fine, because then, once we had a two-state solution, we could transfer out our Arabs into the Palestinian state. And
she didn't exactly say that.
Yes, she did.
No, what she said was they will. No. Let's be exactly accurate. That was the implication of what she said. But what she actually said was the Palestinians will look for their national future there. And people understood it that way, and she probably meant it to be understood that way, but she didn't put it that way literally, and that, I'm sure, is not going to happen.
Well, let me ask that question, because it's one of the arguments that some people have raised. Again, I've heard it specifically from Ali Al-Banima, is that a two-state solution could potentially worsen the situation of Palestinian citizens of Israel.
Yes.
Conversely,
that's what I was saying.
Two-state advocates have argued the opposite, that it would improve their situation.
Right, which he just
so
said.
if you look at the situation of the three parts of the Palestinian community, refugees, people in the occupied territories, and Palestinian citizens of Israel, how do each of you think it would affect each of those?
Well, first of all, I think there's 6 Palestinian fractions, and I don't want to get too complicated about it. But I don't think you should, for instance, lump together the people of Gaza and the people of the West Bank as Palestinians within the territories. I also think you have to take into account Palestinians who are in refugee camps, and I think and also Palestinians who are in Israeli prisons, about 11,000. So these are significant fractions. And I think that it's very important that all of these groups are taken into account and that they come together. And I, for one, don't quite know how that is, and I certainly hope Hussein is going to help them come together. But I think there are significant, differences amongst them in the sense, of course, that we're seeing now. He's to pick up what he said earlier, and here I would defer to his intimate judgment on the ground of how these things are happening. That you're seeing activity amongst Palestinian intellectuals in the diaspora who are taking on for themselves a more active role. And I think, for instance, that the BDS campaign is one that it signals not just a way of delegitimating Israel and weakening the foundations of the Zionist entity and so on, but also it's a way in which you're now beginning to develop an initiative that comes from the Palestinian diaspora as well as from the occupied territories and brings people together. I'm very impressed with some of the people who are working with that, and they're because it gives them a way of operating outside of the dichotomy, which is, I think, very unsatisfactory between Hamas on the one side and the PA on the other, both of which have serious problems.
Okay, well, I want to ask you, so I was going to bring that subject of BDS up.
I'd still like to answer that question.
Yeah, no,
but I wanted to ask a question for clarification.
Sure, absolutely.
You spoke of BDS as working to delegitimize Israel. Now, there's a studied ambiguity in the way BDS is formulated.
Well,
BDS is the abbreviation for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Sorry, in speak. But there's a studied ambiguity in the way it's presented. Some people use BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions, as an argument for pressure to end the occupation, which would be in the context of a two-state solution. Right. But perhaps many more, I don't know, are using it, as Joel Kovel said, to delegitimize Zionism in the state of Israel. But it would seem to me that ambiguity would weaken the argument of how BDS is supposed to work. And I want you both to address the question of how effective do you think BDS is as a strategy. One of the reasons I raise this is that a while ago there was a big news flash that, for example, Hampshire College had divested from Israel. Right. And I happen to know about this very immediately because I'm an alum of Hampshire College. And then the administration, it was attacked, Hampshire College was then attacked by right-wing people, and then Hampshire College administration seemed to deny it.
They did deny it.
They did deny it.
And yet, nevertheless, one still got claims that this was a victory for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. So has, for example, any university or college or municipality actually divested from Israel? And what does divestment actually mean in that context?
Before we start, let me just give a very quick thumbnail answer to the question that Joel answered, but I didn't. What about these different constituencies of Palestinians? And very simply, if there is such a thing as a Palestinian people, they are all constituent parts. Right. And I would argue that the only plausibly achievable liberatory political objective at the moment that presents itself as an accomplishment that would benefit all of them is ending the occupation, creating a state, and going forward from there. So I think they would all benefit to one extent or another, even prisoners. So there's that. The second thing is your question. And I mean, I'm not at all against boycotts in theory. I like them better when they're targeted at the occupation and the structures of the occupation. So, for example, the Norwegian divestment from the company that makes the sensors that are all along the wall in the West Bank is a great piece of divestment. I mean, it hits hard, it hits home, and it's really good. I think more amorphous stuff that we've seen is less effective. I'm certainly not opposed to it. I'm skeptical, ultimately, that you could have a wide range of major American institutions divesting from Israel, given the social structures in the United States, opinions of elites, etc. I'm skeptical. And sorry?
What about academic boycotts?
Academic boycotts? I don't think academic institutions are going to be boycotting Israel in the United States. I think, and ultimately, if they did, it's certainly, boycotts hurt. Boycotts cause pain, they cause economic pain, they cause other things. But boycotts as the primary tool in a national struggle between two ethno-national groups is not going to be the answer. I mean, it might have an effect, But certainly Israel is not going to be brought to its knees by boycotts, even if they did emerge. Let me point out, there's been a boycott against the Palestinians for 60 years. And it's been a very wide-ranging boycott, and it's still in place. And it hasn't made a dent in Palestinian nationalism. Not a dent. And so I'm really kind of skeptical how far the boycotts ultimately could go. I'm not against them at all. But I think also behind this idea that boycotts brought down apartheid in South Africa, I don't think it's reasonable to take away the accomplishment of Joe Slovo and Umkhonto we Sizwe. That was a war. That was a war with guns and bombs and car bombs and frontline states and everything. And yeah, the boycotts helped a lot, but they did not bring down apartheid. Right. No way.
Right.
Yes.
I don't think boycotts can bring down the state of Israel. I think it's harder by far to boycott Israel and divest and sanctions than it was in the case of South Africa, because the South Africans had no serious constituency in the West, and it was very easy to isolate them. But by that very token, I see the boycott and divestment movement excuse me, as essential for the building of a broad movement against Zionism itself. And not only do I see it before my eyes, I see it happening. I think the last year has been a very promising one, spurred by the debacle, the horror of Gaza, and in which you began to see for the first time significant numbers of people, and also Jewish people and Jewish American people. And let's remember that this country is by far the most crucial, but also the most benighted, the most backward of all the countries. If you go to Britain, you'll see a very different picture, for example. And it's important to keep in mind the complexity of the different levels of international movement here. But there's no doubt that what's happening in this country, at least in a part of it where I live in New York City, is quite encouraging. And what's encouraging is there are groups now one called Adala, which I work with in the city,
yeah,
where it's not just a Palestinian group, it's not a Jewish group, it's a group of young people who are coming together, and they are fired up, and they're doing remarkable things. They did a marvelous thing against the Israeli ballet the other day in Brooklyn. I mean, you have to look it up on the web. Yeah. They get dressed up in Israeli flag colored tutus and prance around the street. It appeals to the imagination, and it is moving in a very nice direction, and it is freaking Israel out. Now, we don't know how far that's going to go, but it is freaking Israel out. And I just refer you to the Rayot Institute's reports recently, which you should download, which they're presenting to the Israeli cabinet. And they're not making this up. They're saying, we're seriously worried about this.
I agree with all of that.
And then one last thing.
Sorry.
And the only thing they know how to do is to make it worse for themselves, because they're in a trap. Yeah. So the more these movements grow, the more Israel becomes perturbed and then acts in a way as to further weaken its legitimacy. And I think that's very, very important.
I think all of that, or almost all of that, is right. There's only one addendum to it, which is the implication of your question is right, which is most of the major, if not all of the major success stories for the BDS campaign aren't what they seem to be. And they, the people who supposedly divested almost to an entity say they didn't. And so you have the attribution of a statement to a group that said, well, we're not making that statement. And I'd say if the person who's supposed to be making the statement says, I'm not making the statement, you know what? They didn't make the statement. So until you can start getting major institutions to divest and agree that they've actually divested. But I agree with you. There's a momentum here. And if it's channeled in the right direction, it could be extremely powerful.
You can't freeze it in time. I mean, it's happening. Yeah. And to say it's not going to happen is just to deter it. And you have to take a much more hopeful and perspective. Because I mean, it's like any major social transformation goes through ups and downs and periods of stagnation and despair. But if you keep the momentum going, it gradually and then increasingally in an exponential way takes on force. And
in fact, all branches of the Palestinian movement are in favor of this. There's some disagreement about where you target it. But even the PA is leading a boycott of settlement goods and trying to get things like the Wall Sensor Company and other companies boycotted. So, I mean, it's a question of how you focus it politically. But the PLO is not opposed to this at all, and the PA is not opposed to it either. So,
Okay, well, since the question of Zionism keeps coming up, I wanted to talk more about the politics of one and two states. So I'll ask some questions about Zionism. So at the core of the one-state, two-state issue, there appears to be a dispute over the nature of Zionism. The one-state position seems to view Zionism as an inherently racist expansionist project with which no accommodation is possible. The two-state position, and I'm speaking of Palestinian two-staters now, not Israeli two-staters who come from a different, usually Zionist perspective, tends to have a more nuanced attitude towards Zionism and distinguishes between different types of Zionism, with some of which it holds accommodation is possible. So how should those interested in Palestinian liberation therefore understand and approach the phenomenon of Zionism today? Joel's answer would seem to be that it's a dying phenomenon.
No, it's not dying, but it's wounded, and the question is to kill it off, not to just let it be where it is. No,
So
I mean, I think the thing about Zionism is, of course, there's any number of Zionisms, but there's one crystalline truth to it, and that has to do with, I mean, just there are many instances of this, but it really goes back, for instance, to the Peel Commission, say in 1938, after big Palestinian, national rebellion. They said, well, we're going to partition it, and the Yishuv, the Israeli settlers got really upset at, we don't want to partition it, we want the whole thing. And Ben-Gurion spoke to them and said, listen, guys, we take the partition because if we partition it, then we can build a state. And once you build a state, the state becomes the instrument of force that gets you the whole thing. And that's kind of the history of it all, isn't it? And so you'd have to talk about Zionism as it's not idle, but it's not a coherent strategy, nor an effective one, until it becomes linked with state power. And when it becomes linked with state power, which is legitimated violence and all the rest, then it is capable of doing its will, which is to eliminate everything non-Jewish from the land of historic Palestine. And that, to me, is what makes for serious conflict. Of course, there are envisioned in a future any number of settlements, of religious entities, or a whole variety and range of Jewish, return, which is in my mind a purely imaginary return, but that's another story. To the homeland, which never was the homeland, that's another story. But you can have all that, and you can accommodate all that. But what you can't accommodate is a powerful state that is animated by Zionist principles, and that's the beast that has to be brought down.
I think from the
But it would seem, Joel, that for a period of over 30 years, that the dominant Palestinian strategy was precisely to seek some kind of accommodation with the Zionist state.
You were wrong.
Well, first it was to seek the overthrow.
And then having been defeated by the state, to seek an accommodation.
Also having to recognize, and this goes to the thrust of my remarks. I'm not. Joel is very interested in Zionism, and I think it's a very interesting thing theoretically as a political problem, and I think it's something that certainly Jews around the world, Jewish Israelis, and also Arabs living in Israel, and people, people would take more or less seriously depending on their emphasis. But my book is subtitled, so it's called "What's Wrong with the One-State Agenda." The subtitle is "Why Ending the Occupation and Peace with Israel is Still the Palestinian National Goal." And it is, that's a fact. It's a national goal because it's the goal being pursued by the PLO, which is legally and diplomatically the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. It's also the goal supported by overwhelming majority of the Palestinian people. So it is the national goal. The question is why? And the answer is because the problem of Zionism, really, I think, is secondary to the problem that confronts the Palestinians. So here we really, really disagree fully. Because what confronts the Palestinians is not an abstract political theory of Zionism, it's the Israeli state. And the Israeli state, you could say, is motivated ultimately by Zionism, but you know what? It is, but it exists independent of Zionism. Right? It has a momentum of its own. There is a whole generation of Jewish Israelis for whom Zionism is not a set of principles to which they ascribe. The Israeli national identity is something they have been born into. And that's different than affiliating voluntarily with a set of principles because you are a Zionist the way someone is a socialist or a communist or a fascist or a Trotskyist. No, I'm saying for the Palestinians, they have to look at what is the force that confronts it. It's a state. Is there a reasonable prospect of defeating the state militarily and acquiring independence in the occupied territories, of driving the Israelis out of West Bank and East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip militarily, the way, for example, Hezbollah was able to do in South Lebanon through a combination of guerrilla war and increasingly more conventional things? No, because the stakes are very different. The capabilities the Palestinians have are very different. The reality is very different. So the Palestinians look at their situation, I think, from the point of view of their national strategy, which is a little bit different, as I say, than where Phil is coming from. They go, look, what we're confronting actually is the Israeli state and the Israeli army, not the abstract principles of Zionism. So we have to figure out how to rid ourselves of this occupation, which is a very different project than eliminating Zionism altogether, I would argue. The two are really not the same objective. They require different strategies and tactics. They are of a different order of magnitude, right? And so for me, ultimately, this argument about Zionism is one for, which should properly be had in Israel with input from other people around the world. And the Palestinians in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, have their own argument about their own society. And I think that's the way these things should go.
I have a question which, given what you said, I think is really more a question for Joel, since I think I know your answer, Hussein. But it's a more theoretical question, even goes beyond Zionism. So during the debates after the French Revolution on the emancipation of the Jews, Clermont-Tonnerre uttered the memorable phrase, "To the Jews as individuals, everything. To the Jews as a nation, nothing." The notion that Jews should have full civil and religious rights but no national rights was long held as axiomatic, with few exceptions by left and liberal thinkers. It's echoed in Article 18 of the Palestinian National Charter, which asserts that Judaism is a revealed religion but not a nation. And for a long time, this was the Palestinian attitude. So the question then is, should this rejection of national rights for Jews be maintained, or is it either a moral or simply a practical necessity? I'm sure you would say it's a practical necessity to recognize, Hussein, Israeli Jews as a national community, not only a religious community. And if one does recognize them as a national community, how does this affect the question of one versus two states? In other words, is one therefore implying that if you recognize that you're for one state, you're for a binational state, then what would that mean? Or are you for just a secular democratic state? I mean, these are always... Well, I assume it's really for you, because I think Hussein is given it. Yes.
I have a long answer.
Yeah, so let's get mine out of the way. My only observation would be to say that is exactly the attitude that the West and the Israeli state has taken towards the Palestinians since the Balfour Declaration, which talked about the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities, that is to say 75, 95%. Well, and as a practical matter, Palestinians are granted, to one extent or another, some degree of their rights. Inside Israel's a larger degree, in the occupied territories much less, but certainly not their national project. And that my only observation is to say you've got two national movements that doesn't recognize the legitimacy of the other one. And this is at heart not something that's going to, I think, change anytime in the near future. And the only way around that is to have two national projects side by side each other until such time as you can come. One of the only ways I can imagine getting to a two-state outcome without a mutual decimation and exhaustion that is almost unimaginable, which is the other way I imagine you might get there, although it's the least likely outcome of a giant war. But the other way is to have two states that then subsequently kind of voluntarily merge because it makes sense over time. And so I think there's a real reason for people who believe in ultimate unification to be sympathetic about ending the occupation now. In other words, I don't see any great contradiction between a one-state aspiration for the far future, which seems plausible, and a two-state immediate solution now, which ends the occupation. I think one is dependent on the other. Okay. So anyway, I'm sorry.
Joe, you can give
Well, I don't know. But there's a lot to say on it. I mean, I personally am not an aficionado of nationalism. I don't think it's the best that human beings do. And I think we have to grant it as an extraordinary power under certain historical circumstances. We do know that the idea is not immemorial. It rose at a certain stage in history, and I think it can very easily be seen to disappear at another stage in history. I personally think it should be gone and be better off without it. But I do think that it's not an absolute right in any case, and it depends on its fruits, but the fruits depend upon the organism that gives rise to them. And here I think it's important to bear in mind that there is something fundamentally flawed about the idea of Jewish nationalism from the very beginning, because it did not arise on the basis of an integral relationship to a place, but only on a mythological relationship to a place. And as a result... Yes.
But don't Israelis, aside from Jews, have a relationship?
Israelis have now they have a nationalism. We'll get to that. But I'm talking about what entered into that. And what entered into that is the necessity, since there was no Poland or Ireland, to go back to express your nationalism through expropriation of another's territory. You know that. In other words, nationalism became colonialism, became settler colonialism, which became inevitably racism, and which built the Israeli state, the bizarreness of which we haven't begun to appreciate today. I mean, there's a tendency in, I think, very well-meaning and astute discussions such as Hussein is developing to sort of elide just how nuts the Israeli state is, and to think that they are somehow a reasonable entity. They are not a reasonable entity. I mean, and one reason they're not a reasonable entity is because, again, the nationalism has been nourished in this bizarre relationship with the United States, that guarantees their impunity. And that impunity builds into itself, going back to just read about the SS Liberty, where they destroyed an American warship, and President Johnson says we're not even going to investigate this. It's the fifth day of the Six-Day War. And that impunity brings out and reproduces all of the violent, paranoid, and exterminative impulses. Okay? So and think of the nuclear arsenal, and think of how they want to make war with Iran, which doesn't have one, but they're going to get one, and their own nuclear arsenal is not even to be mentioned, much less brought into the realm of international politics. There's much more to be said about that, but I'm saying that all arises from the very pathological kind of nationalism that infused the development of the Zionist project and the Israeli state was the fruit of that and the instrument of that at the same time. And if only that instrument were showing signs of becoming more temperate, more moderate, more reasonable, more capable of making adjustments, that would be very nice. But remember, the Israeli state started off as a socialist kind of orientation. It started as a very egalitarian society. It's now the most unequal society on the face of the earth. It is now a virtually fascist society. It's propelled by increasing reserves of violent religious extremism, which are taking over the idea. All of those things make the notion that some of you are going to reason with these people just a fantasy.
But Joe, assume one accepts your dire portrayal of Israel. Doesn't that make a one-state solution even more impossible? Because you're saying that these people are crazy, psychotic racists with nuclear weapons, and then you're saying, but we're all going to live peacefully as citizens.
I don't know how we can live with them, frankly. And when I speak, the hardest time I have is having to deal with Palestinians who say, I can't countenance sharing the land with these horrible people who have done such awful things for the last 60 and more years. I think it is a dreadful circumstance, that dreadful situation. I think that, I'm a physician by training. You're dealing with a very, very sick entity here, and you have to make the best possible goal for it. The best possible goal still is to mobilize the forces of human rights and to delegitimate the Israeli state piece by piece, not violently, but gradually break it away, out-migration, fundamental breakdown, and to work in this country to break the grip of the lobby of the United States policy.
But the reality facing the Palestinian national movement is rather different.
Yes.
The reality is not, do the Palestinians decide in their magnanimity to share their land between the River and the Sea with the Jewish Israelis? The problem facing them is how the hell to get the Jewish Israelis out of the occupied territories, and they're a huge army, and that's the problem facing them. So, in other words, the exigency is to do that, and so it sets up a very different dynamic.
I don't think you can do it, though, with Zionism ruling the Jewish state. I mean, I think
then it becomes the question: how do you do it? And as I said, the argument that exists in Palestinian society is between the secular and national say, look, there are these leverages we can use, the demographic stuff, the international law, the pressure state building that we're doing, obviously, blah, blah, blah. We can do that, and there is no other choice other than a diplomatic agreement because we cannot secure a military victory. There is another voice. The other voice is that of the Islamists, who say God is on our side, and if we sacrifice ourselves enough and use armed struggle until death, we will win because God is on our side. That's the big argument among Palestinians right now. Yeah. In reality,
and it's a grim picture.
I have two sets of related questions that are both about psychology. I'm going to ask one about Palestinians for Hussein and one about Jews for Joel.
Right.
The question about Palestinians for Hussein is that there was this shift starting in the mid-70s, clear shift towards a two-state solution that was explicitly articulated by the early 80s and then the Oslo Accords, so that by the 90s it seemed as though the two-state solution was a universal consensus, at least among Palestinians.
it was for a while.
It was. And since the outbreak of the Second Intifada, we've seen a reversion to earlier modes of speaking on the part of some people, some Palestinian intellectuals.
Yeah.
You say they're not significant. The question is, what accounts for that in your view?
Okay.
Why is
I
it
don't
that-
say they're not significant. If I thought they weren't significant, I wouldn't have written a book arguing that they're wrong. So obviously they are significant. But what I'm saying is they're not a political factor in Palestine. There aren't any Palestinian political factions that have taken up the one-state argument, any one-state argument, certainly not the one that exists on college campuses in the U.S. and Britain, and among grassroots activists also here. So they're not a political factor in the internal Palestinian debate. But what accounts for the rise of this is that the Second Intifada, as I said earlier, was very bloody and very vicious and caused a great deal of pain on both sides. And everyone did a reassessment of what kind of peace was possible and desirable. And in Israel, this produced the swing to the right, the election of Sharon, and the situation we're still living with this extremely right-wing government, filled with people to the right of Netanyahu, if you can believe that, and it is true. Among Palestinians in the occupied territories, the main effect was the rise of Islamists, mainly Hamas, and also the fact that even the secular nationalists had to start employing this religious rhetoric, like the Al-Aqsa Intifada and all that kind of stuff, like the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigade, and those were Fatah things, so as not to be outbid on religious legitimacy by the Islamists. And what I've argued is that the rise of one-state rhetoric among pro-Palestinian advocates in the West reflects the same kind of negative reevaluation. I don't think it's a return exactly. I mean, the rhetoric is very reminiscent of the 60s and 70s. And even some people call for a return to the three no's of the Khartoum Declaration. No negotiation, no peace, no nothing with Israel. But the form is slightly different. And I don't think it's a return to classical PLO rhetoric. It's something else, although it's certainly a return to a very strident national narrative that used to characterize the discourse in the 60s and 70s. So that's where it comes from. It comes from a place of pain. It comes from the experience of the Second Intifada, and more broadly, I don't want to shortchange this. It comes from 16 years of fruitless negotiations, right? Watching the peace process, which is all process and no peace, and doubling the settlers every few years, and watching the occupied territories get eaten up, bit by bit by the occupation. And this has led many people to conclude that diplomacy is pointless and a two-state agreement is not possible. And one more quick thing. Almost all Palestinian and pro-Palestinian one-state advocacy begins with the absolute assertion that a two-state solution is impossible. And it's rooted in perfectly truthful descriptions of a critical mass of settlements and settlers and other topographical and administrative changes imposed on the occupied territories by the occupation. And that's true. But I think the implication here is that those things are fait accompli, and they can never be changed and they can never be reversed. Whereas, in fact, of course, they are the product of political will, and they can be reversed or adjusted as the result of a political will. And I think that there is a much better metric for looking at the viability of a two-state agreement, which is the question of political will. You look at what do a majority of Palestinians and Israelis want. They both want the same thing. An overwhelming majority say they want a two-state agreement, and they also don't think it will happen, and they don't believe the other side. Those three things. Now, I say as long as a solid majority on both sides want this, you have a reservoir of political will, which can be used to address the question of this critical mass involved. And it's more complicated than that, but that's a much better metric than saying, well, there are too many settlements. Because then you have to say, well, okay, it was possible, but now it's not. When is the tipping point? We don't know. It's a bad metric, because these are subject to political will. Political will is a better metric.
Okay, and my question for Joel, which is about Jewish psychology. In your book on overcoming Zionism, you go back and deep into the history. You go back, and I actually found this rather disturbing, but you go back and talk about the Old Testament, talk about the Talmud, you use phrases like Judaic being. You have an anecdote about your own alienation from your own synagogue experience, whatever, in your youth. And so even though you don't say this, there is some sense that you see many of the negative aspects of Zionism, in your view, as coming from some deep Jewish history. And so the question is, if one adopts that attitude, which I would disagree with, but if one isn't saying overcoming Zionism in some way a request for people to overcome Judaism?
Mm-hmm. That's a very important point. Can I just real quick finish? I'm glad you brought up that question about the feasibility of the two-state solution in light of what's happened in the last 15, 20 years. And my point about that is, yes, it is a question of political will. But the political will that can make it on the Israeli side can only be a non-Zionist political will. In other words, and maybe that's the way in which Israel moves beyond Zionism, which is possible. Because it's anti-Zionist. And not anti-Zionist, whatever. But
I don't agree with that.
Okay, we don't agree. Okay, I just wanted to say that.
And there is a Zionist argument for Judaism.
Yeah. I don't
Which
think
is the
so.
preservation of a Jewish majority.
Right. It's not going to work because of the democratic fears they have, etc. Let's forget that. I want to talk about the other question, which really does vex me a lot. And I tried to make it also clear in the book, and I don't think you represent that in what you said.
No, I'm only emphasizing one part.
No. In the book, I said that there is an existential fissure, rupture in Jewishness, and that one side of which leads to universality, and the other side of which to a recurrent and reinforced struggles. And it's that. So I mean, it's very clear to me that yes, it is involved. It is a part of the fate of the Jewish people. The Jewish people made this terrible decision to build that state, and it was, I think, a huge mistake. It's a mistake. In the first place, it's a mistake to put it there. It's a mistake to put it out, and so on and so forth. And now they're reaping very, very grim harvest of that terrible mistake. I like to put it on the level of a mistake because I mean, it is a sense in which it's it's an idea, and ideas can be changed. And ideas have no civil rights. A bad idea can be dropped, can be abandoned, but it requires people being able to give up that idea. And I think the Jews have to give up that idea. And I think
the idea of Zionism.
The idea of Zionism and the idea of Jewish exceptionalism, the idea that we're entitled to this resolution of our history, which we're not, the idea that the sufferings of the Holocaust are somehow enable imposing this fate upon people, mainly the Palestinians, who never did anything to contribute to the suffering and the like. And I think there have been profound errors made on the part of the Jewish people. I myself, I feel like Spinoza. I hope excommunicate me. I don't care. But there's a lot of other Jews who have to come to grips with this. Now, what I'm seeing, and this is something, talk about polls. Polls amongst Jewish people say that there's a very striking difference according to generation, and that younger Jewish people are increasingly detached from and ill at ease with the notions of Zionism. And the older the Jewish person, the more existentially.
Yeah, this is in the United States. The problem is that in Israel, the same thing may be happening, but Zionism is being supplanted by an Israeli identity, which is communal and national and divorced from these principles, and therefore existential, and that makes it very difficult to deal with.
Potentially Nazi, okay?
Oh, potentially?
Yes.
Well,
and at this point, fascist, and it has a terrible trajectory to it, I would agree. And I think that this puts before the Jewish people the imperative to reassess who they are and who they have been. Not going to what I did in this book, which is very fragmentary. Maybe 10, 15 pages. And by the way, I'm working on another book that you'll do a thorough job on. But it's not the point. I think this is the task for Jewish people. I don't think that Jewish people have, by and large, measured up to it.
Can I say that actually dovetails with my earlier point, which is that this argument about Zionism, I agree, it's one that Jews should have, but it's a little bit extraneous to the question of the Palestinian national strategy, which can't be held up by this philosophical argument about the nature of Zionism. It has to deal with the immediate realities of the occupation, which is something that has to end, as I said yesterday. It's every day goes on its way to
If I'm correct, we disagree with that.
Yes.
If I'm correct in saying that what's holding up any changes is the grip of Zionism.
But they have to test that. See, yeah, okay, but they have to test that by trying it.
Look what they just done. They just took over sites in Hebron.
They've designated. Yeah, they designated. I understand that. But I don't think it would be a wise national strategy for the Palestinian people to say, all right, we're never gonna get anywhere with these guys. I mean, we have to recognize that we have no power. We have to wait for, I don't know, the international community or the Jews of the world to change their mind or something. No, they have to try all the different options that they can that are plausible. And you may be mistaken. And if you are, here's the point: if you are and they follow your strategy, they would be consigned themselves to decades of more occupation that might be avoidable.
No, but what I was saying is that there's a growing, not unity, but a cross fertilization between Jewish and Palestinian groups in this country.
Yeah, that's very helpful.
And that, I think,
that's helpful.
Is a huge vector towards.
Well, I agree with that.
First of all, I think, Joel, the question that I was raising was the relationship that you seem to imply about the negative aspects of Zionism coming from Judaism or deep Jewish history, rather than Zionism being a modern political phenomenon, not one rooted in an ancient Jewish history or a Jewish way of being. But let's leave that subject aside because I want to raise a more political question, which is related to Jews. In the United States, since the Second Intifada, we've seen the rise of various liberal and left Jewish groups concerned with Israel, Palestine, and U.S. policy. Some of these, like Tzedek Shalom and J Street, chose to describe themselves as pro-Israel, pro-peace, whereas others, such as Not My Name, Jewish Voice for Peace, American Jews for Just Peace, avoided the term pro-Israel, and some are even explicitly anti-Zionist. So what is your attitude towards them, and what distinctions would you make between them?
The more anti-Zionist, the better.
But what about the ones that are not anti-Zionist?
Well, there's the reason with them. I've been to debates with them. Yeah. Much more disagreement between
but Hussein's position and Tzedek or J Street would seem to be politically the same. So they're coming from a different.
There's some similarities, but there are differences. I agree. Let me say my angle is I am very ecumenical about this. I want to meet with, talk to, and work with anyone who wants to end the occupation. That's my litmus test. You want to end the occupation? I want to talk to you. That's it. And if you're the ZOA that supports the occupation, I got nothing to say to you, but I got nothing to say to Hamas either. But if you want to end the occupation, well, let's sit down and do it.
And let's debate it more inclined.
Me too.
God, is that cheaper?
I won't go into it.
We'll talk that later.
Try to offer me a job
I want to
if I
say
change my mind.
that was quite an experience.
It's funny.
But
That was the very start of my career. It was an astonishing experience.
And then,
Well, at any rate, that's sort of where I draw the line.
okay.
Have to sort themselves out.
Well, I sort of want to open up to
Yeah,
the
we
floor,
probably should.
but I do want to ask one other question.
There's one I'm waiting for, but go on.
Well, there actually are really two questions left.
Okay.
One is a question that was not raised by us, but was imposed by, which is that neither of you is actually Palestinian.
This is the one I was waiting for.
You are a non-Palestinian Arab, and you're
Right.
an American Jew. And the question was raised by people: what right do you have to talk about this issue?
You want to go first, or shall I?
I'll go first, and then you can.
Fine.
Because you went first. But
Suits
no,
me.
it's an easy one. I mean, the situation in Palestine requires self-determination by Palestinians, but the situation of Palestine in the world involves everyone and everybody in this country, Jewish or not. I mean, let's be frank about this. The so-called war on terror is, and whatever, which is a basket of very dubious and crazy assumptions and all that, but also very real, is generated more than anything else by this situation. And this is a matter simply of straight quotations from the people who have been apprehended or associated with, quote, terrorist activities. They say that what gets them the most is the United States relationship to Israel. And so, yes, Palestine has to be a matter of self-determination of Palestinians, but when our buildings in this country are flown into by planes, or when a guy, puts...
None of those people were Palestinians, I would point out.
Exactly, that's not the point. And rather, that is the point, is that it radiates out from Palestine. And it's not at all simply a Palestinian question. Yeah. It is, in my view, the agonal question about Western penetration of the Orient, okay, and of which Palestine happens to be the stage. And we must not sacrifice the people whose lives have been tossed into that horrible circumstance. They have to have their day of self-determination. This makes it complicated. But it very definitely involves the entirety of civilization. Okay? And certainly the entirety of Islamic civilization. You have 1 billion people there who are furious at what has gone on between the U.S. and Israel, and are not going to stop being furious with Obama, in power and doing the kinds of things he's doing.
I agree with the overall thrust of that. I don't agree that that this clear linkage between 9/11 and the issue of Palestine. I think it's not right. I think Palestine is an issue that was deployed cynically by Al-Qaeda, and these were not Palestinians. They never did anything about it. They just use it rhetorically. On the other hand, there's a clear linkage between Palestine as the prism of pain through which the Arabs specifically and the Muslims generally look at international relations, and it does poison everything. And this is by far the most difficult and painful conflict totally disproportionate to its size. The political significance that people all over the world have invested in it means that Joel is absolutely right. It is something that everyone may have an opinion about. I'd say that even more specifically, I may have an opinion about it because not only am I an Arab, I'm an Arab from Ras Beirut, which is probably about as close as you can come to a similar experience, and it invests me with a certain. This has changed my life. This conflict has totally shaped my own personal life, like where I'm living, what country I'm in. It's absolutely connected to this conflict. In addition to which, I represent an organization that has a leadership that's entirely Palestinian American, about 45 board of director members that employ me, and I've been active on this issue for 20 years. Now, what's really interesting is that my non-Palestinian status was never an issue for any Arabs at all until this dispute between two-state advocates and one-state advocates came up. And all of a sudden, all these people started coming out of the woodwork and saying, oh, well, you're not a Palestinian. You're just a Lebanese. You're just an Arab. You got no right to talk about this. I find this to be extraordinarily ridiculous and offensive and absurd. And you can take a number and get in line to anoint my behind with that one. Because, at a certain point, it becomes, frankly, kind of an ethnically pejorative statement, or at least national origin pejorative statement that has no place in things. There's one more point. Why are there no Palestinian Americans at this table? It's certainly not because the organizers didn't invite them. I watched the organizers of this excellent event go tie themselves into pretzels trying to get an Arab or a Palestinian one-stater to come here. I told them from the outset. I was approached for this idea at the J Street conference by an individual who said, wouldn't it be great to have a debate? I said, yes, but, there's no chance in hell they'll agree. So we'll try. Months and months of trying. I told them they will not agree. The Arab and Palestinian one-staters will not debate me. Number one, they are very unsure of their arguments, and it's clear from my book and everything I've done that I understand their case better than they do, and they were not expecting this, and they don't know how to deal with a pro-Palestinian voice that is credible and established that says, listen, there's serious holes and problems with your theory. It's great if they debate Benny Morris, the racist, and a swine who merely bolsters all their arguments in his stupid attack. But to deal with me is very difficult. In addition, I think they're scared, because I know how to make arguments. And I don't blame them. I'd be scared too. So on both counts, they don't want to do it. And I knew they wouldn't do it, yeah? So eventually, as I said from the beginning, we would have to go to the Jewish one-state advocates to get a one-state voice that had the testicular fortitude to come and have a conversation.
Okay.
And it's too bad.
You mean cojones?
Yeah, that's what I mean. And so basically, bottom line is, if there's no Palestinian on this stage, right, it's certainly not because of Professor Kovel or me, or the organizers, for that matter.
On that self-deprecating note, I want to move to the last question. So how do class divisions within both Israeli and Palestinian society affect the conflict? For example, Joel, in your book, The Enemy of Nature, you explicitly express the need to overcome capitalism to avoid environmental catastrophe.
I think I say smash it.
Smash capitalism. Okay, and you are explicitly a Marxist, or a non-conventional. Yet you do not seem to see a similarly intimate connection between overcoming Zionism and overcoming capitalism. So the question then is there any real connection that either of you see between capitalism and the struggle over Israel-Palestine, or are questions of socialism and capitalism essentially irrelevant to the conflict in your view?
Not in the least. I mean, the book does take it up, but in a definitely a shadowed way. It's not foregrounded, and that's tactical, simply tactical. And on other occasions, I've spoken openly about it, and it's. I mean, I think the relevant issue here is South Africa. Now, these comparisons are problematic, needless to say, but I think it is very much the case that we have to learn from South Africa, because that's a one-state solution that nobody thought could happen. It happened, but it didn't happen very well. And I know a lot about South Africa.
I think a lot of people did think it could happen, but
yeah, well, we'll deal with that. But I'm just saying, my son lives there. I spend a lot of time in South Africa, and it's a very unhappy place. And yet, I know that
Then what should
only
we learn?
lunatics would want to go back
Right.
to the situation before
Definitely better.
1994. It's definitely better because it's created an openness and there's a lot of struggle going on there. Now, what happened there was very simple. I mean, obviously not simple, but you know, elemental in that a deal was cut to retain the power of the South African and global bourgeoisie, but move them to the side of the ANC. And the ANC said, okay, you give us the national, you know, political arena that we need, and
You can keep your stuff.
you can run the economy, and you know, integrate you with global capital.
that's it.
And there's much more to be said, but that's very much the case. And what that means, basically, is that you have a situation in which 40% of the people are immediately declared useless because they don't generate surplus value, blah blah blah, and and there's hell to pay, which is being paid. Now, obviously, there's distinctions, there's big distinctions between Israeli capitalism and South African capitalism. South Africa is a powerhouse with huge reserves of, you know, an industrial base. Israel is a casino capitalist country with fancy, high-tech, militarized, you know, industries and the like. But there's no question that that issue has to be confronted, and has to be confronted in a way that really requires, you know, very forceful, you know, interventions. And I can keep on going on that. But
Okay, but Joe, can I ask you a
Yeah.
question about that?
Yeah.
All of the one-state books I've read more than one
Yeah, yeah.
one-state book, completely sidestep issues of class and the nature of the economy.
Yeah.
The assumption
Well,
of
I
all of
don't
them
do that.
is that the one democratic state will be one
No.
democratic normal capitalist state like other states.
I don't believe that's the case. And as I say, I'm writing another book, and I'll
Okay,
make
so-
sure to give that more
So we won't
attention.
be able to say that after you publish it.
No, I said it
Good.
in Overcoming Zionism, but I said it in
Subtly.
a quiet way.
Subtly, yeah.
And I'm going to, in speaking, I never
Okay.
hold back.
Okay.
Do you want to address the issues?
Yeah, oh, definitely. Although I must say, I mean, to tease out the element of class in the Palestinian struggle and the Palestinian reality and the Palestinian future is a huge issue. I mean, it really is a daunting question because it's so complicated. But a couple of things that I think are worth noting. First is that I don't think I'm going to get an argument for anybody in this room if I started launching a kind of a critique of global neoliberalism, all right? And I doubt we would have a big fight about that. But let me say that the one arena in which I don't think the case against global neoliberalism should be kind of deployed is in the question of the occupied territories. In other words, I think there's something much more urgent in the occupied territories than the problem of neoliberal regimes. There is an occupation that supersedes that problem. It's much more elemental. I mean, you have people with no passports. You have people with no country. There are people who live under different laws than the people of another ethnicity who live next door to them. You have checkpoints. You have the whole society choked. It's an order of magnitude that's different, and the nature and the cause of it are different, in my view. Now, so I would say that, you know, it's something to keep in mind, but it is neither the cause nor the solution of the occupation, in my opinion. The second point I'd make is that the class element among Palestinians is really kind of a very serious problem, because you have first the division between the old landed classes and the peasantry, and a lot of the refugee population, and also a lot of the kind of ordinary people of the occupied territories come from the old peasant classes and the old working classes, and they get, I think, sometimes instrumentalized by Palestinian elites. And this is something that has been an unfortunate hallmark of this particular struggle, but it's being superseded by something which should be very familiar to people who study political developments, which is the rise of the new social classes in the context of the new political orders that have emerged. First of all, the PA order in the West Bank, and secondly, the Hamas order in Gaza has produced, predictably enough, new social classes, right? New ruling classes that are structured around those elite forces. And there are two things happening simultaneously. One is what the PA government is doing in structured around the Prime Minister's office under the President's protection with the state and institution building. One of the things they're doing is creating a new independent administrative structure, which eventually would again give rise to another new social class, but it's challenging the existing new social class. That is the cadres of Fatah that have control over patronage, money, contracts, etc. And that's one of the reasons there's a lot of resistance to this from the cadres, the upper cadres in Fatah. It's something like glasnost and perestroika in a way, I mean, depending on what you think of that. At least it is certainly an effort to take privilege away from people ensconced in a party and transfer it onto something that is more meritocratic and less patronage oriented. That's one movement. In Gaza you have something completely different, which is the really rapid rise of a new social class centered around Hamas rule. And a really strong distinction. One of the things that people say in Gaza now is, if you want justice, you better have a beard. You know, Hamas is starting to construct a beyond authoritarian. It's drifting towards a totalitarian structure. The lack of freedom is absolutely extraordinary. One of the most striking things about this sex scandal that's going on in the West Bank is not that there's a sex scandal among a politician. Right, you know, go figure. Right, it's shocking among Palestinians, a very conservative people. But you know, I mean, these things happen, and it's nothing you sweep under the rug or mitigate. But you know, if you have politicians, there are going to be corruption scandals, including sex scandals. Well, the one thing that a lot of people in the Arabic language press have been noting is that this can't happen in Gaza, not because the Gaza leadership is incapable of it, although they do seem more interested in power than money or sex, but nonetheless, it's not because of that, it's because there is no discursive freedom to put it out, discuss it, have a controversy, etc. So you have the rise then also of a new social class in Gaza that's really very troubling. And so I think this is something the Palestinian movement absolutely has to deal with. It's not only traditional economic-based sort of peasant landowner class structures. There are these new social classes that are very, very dangerous. And, you know, is it something... I'm sorry. Well, anyway,
no,
that's
I mean,
it.
I was going to see if...
And there's so much more than that, but that's okay. At least something worth thinking about,
I was
all
going
right?
to propose at this point that we open it up for questions from the floor.
Sure.
So if people can line up, and Chase will...
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for being so patient.
Thank you to the panelists and to Richard Rubin for moderating. We already have a queue going in the center. Just
nice.
make sure that it's a question so that it ends in a question mark. Please try to be abundantly respectful to the panelists and keep it short. Thanks.
This is for both speakers. Before 1948, there seemed to be a space for radical politics that weren't rooted in ethnic or religious nationalism.
In Palestine, you mean?
No, I'm talking about nationally, but I'm going to get to the Palestine part at the end.
You mean in the United States?
I mean internationally.
Internationally.
Internationally,
okay.
Yeah. So are there groups that we can look to in Palestine that have radical politics that aren't rooted in religiously grounded radical politics or ethnically grounded radical politics?
Yes, at least two different kinds, if I might. One, but they're small and they're marginal. But I'll tell you what they are. And the first are the kind of traditional intellectual leaders who are really, they don't have great political force, they don't have great political organization, but they do have politics, if not radical, at least influenced by radical politics. So people like Hanan Ashrawi and the Abd al-Shafi family and Mustafa Barghouti and people like that, certainly influenced by international left discourse. And they are kind of a traditional quasi-radical leadership. And it's more rhetorical and discursive what they do. I think the other space where you find it is in the nonviolent protest movement in the West Bank. Admittedly, and I think it's important to recognize, it is taking place in an environment shaped politically by the PA and with the approval and support of Fayyad and Abbas and whatnot. However, the nonviolent protesters who've targeted the wall, very effective nonviolent protests, are clearly influenced. I mean, although it is supported by the PA very strongly, it is sort of Gramscian in its quality, in its decentralized grassroots quality, and in the way it approaches politics. And it's been very effective in the extremely limited context of specific villages. And it has forced the Israelis to actually reroute the wall in the case of one village. So this is a great thing and deserves support, but I don't think you can fail to see that the main argument is still between secular nationalists of a rather ordinary variety and the ultra-religious right on the other hand. So these are nascent groups, and one can only hope that they grow, but that's my answer for you.
I had also a small, somewhat marginalized list, and that was on the list. I don't see it as having that much to do with PA, but I'm sure it has something. I mean, I see it as these people who they call themselves anarchists, really, and they're not philosophical anarchists. They just don't want any authority telling them what to do. And they're very brave, and they made a lot of a difference.
Heroic guys.
Yeah, heroic, yeah, wonderful. Bilin is the town where they've actually had some positive effect, and it's remarkable, and it's really worth emphasizing. There was a group called Matzpen, which
it was in a group of Israeli Trotskyists. Actually.
Yeah, well, internationalists.
They were part of the Fourth International.
They're still around, some of them, and some of them friends of mine. They mostly live in England now. There's Michel Borshevsky, who goes back and forth. He has the International Information. I'm blocking the name. It is a
Alternative Information Center?
Alternative Information Center. I'm sorry.
Oh, those guys.
Yeah, they're very good. And for instance, they did a study on Israeli universities, which is important to bear in mind in terms of just an aside about the divestment and the boycott, showing every major Israeli university is actively taking part in the occupation. And so this is not like, academic freedom, we got to boycott. We don't want to upset our Israeli colleagues. Every university in Israel is doing big time work for the idea, and so that has to be factored in. And there are people studying that. Rashevsky is one, but also you do have a significant group of military resistors within Israel. Some of them quite young, many of them women, and in general, I think there's a big division, an ominous division within the military, which is the dominant institution in Israeli society by far. We didn't underscore that, but I'm sure
it's definitely true.
I'm sure we agree on that.
Absolutely.
And but one problem is that increasingly the lower echelons are being influenced by hard right-wing religious cases, but there's also refuseniks and various people who are not doing it, and they're traveling around the world, and they should be supported.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This question is for Mr. Ibish.
Yeah.
I think you've set out a very rational, well-founded argument for a solution that serves the interests of Palestinians and brings about not only peace but also advantages to the Israeli state. Given this, why is it that the Israeli government has not carried out the steps you've outlined?
No, I think that's a really important point. I think there are a couple of reasons why, even though it's in Israel's self-interest. I mean, look at the present Israeli government. You've got at least three currents in it, right? You've got the kind of Lieberman-dominated current, the ultra-right, which doesn't think an agreement is possible, and even if it were, they don't want it. Right? They're really opposed to an agreement. They say they're for it, but they're not. It's pretty clear. Then you've got the kind of Barak wing, which represents the kind of military structure in Israel, and as you said, the the defense and national security element in Israel, which is the dominant in many ways, and it's certainly what you might call the permanent government of Israel. I mean, politicians come and go, but the generals are there, and Professor Kovel is exactly right about that. And then you've got Netanyahu and the people immediately around him, which kind of serve almost as a referee between the two sides and try to keep the ball in the air. Now, of the people who have understood that it is either a strategic interest or a strategic imperative for Israel to make such an agreement, there are two problems. Number one, there's the fact that there's all this ideological power on the other side and a great infiltration of ministries and administrative bodies by supporters of the occupation. That's a very, very serious problem. The other has been a lack of conviction that it can actually be made to work. And one of the most interesting phenomena recently is that this state and institution building plan has prompted a critical reassessment, I think, on the part of a bunch of Israelis who thought this would be a very good idea, maybe a necessity, but difficult to achieve, now confronted by the notion that not only is it achievable, it's actually happening without our permission. Holy crap. And this is having quite an impact on their thinking. And as I say, I don't think they've decided yet whether this is something to celebrate or to panic, whether it's something to promote or strangle. I think they can't figure it out because they were saying for the whole time, you should be doing this and this and that. Saying it to Arafat and saying it to Abu Mazen maybe were not, it wasn't risky. But now comes man-in-suit technocrat who can actually do it, and more, he is doing it, and your bluff is called. And now you have to ask yourself if you ever meant it.
One quick thing. Oh, go ahead.
I just have a factual question. Hussein, in your opinion, what percentage of the Israeli public or the Israeli Knesset would be people whom you could seriously make peace with?
I mean, I don't know about the Knesset at the moment. Knesset comes and goes. I mean, I'm not sure. But let me say,
what parties would you think would represent a reasonable Israeli?
You can never really tell with parties, actually, to be honest. I wouldn't want to say. Let me say this: opinion polls suggest that 60 to 70% minimum of Jewish Israelis are in favor of a two-state agreement. Now, there is a problem with this, which is it may be that when Palestinians say they want a two-state agreement, Israelis say they want a two-state agreement, they're talking about two very different things. And that we saw at Camp David, when the Israelis really thought they were making a generous offer, and the Palestinians were saying, you're out of your minds. So obviously there's need for further movement before we can actually have an agreement. But to me, honestly, the Israelis have to face a simple choice. They can either have the occupation or they can have their Israeli state. They can't have both. With the occupation in place, it's neither a democracy nor meaningfully Jewish. And so if this Israeli state is supposed to be a Jewish democracy, it isn't going to be, it isn't. I mean, Ehud Barak at Herzliya conference the other day said, we will be an apartheid state if we're not careful, which I think is a very politically savvy way of saying to his fellow Israelis, hey, folks, we are an apartheid state, or we're well on the way, and it's virtually irreversible. And the only way to avoid the situation of having a de facto Israeli state with more Palestinians in it than Jews, and which can neither be called Jewish or democratic in any meaningful sense, is to end the occupation. But the South African analogy is a good one, but all the pressures that led to this deal of, well, we give you power and we keep all our stuff, which was the deal between this huge majority of disenfranchised people and this small minority of privileged people, all those same calculations point, in this case, to an end to the occupation. It's the best deal the Israelis can get.
Citing another Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert this time, in 2007 said that, and this I think perhaps sums it up from your standpoint. We've got to put forward this two-state solution, because if we don't, the American people, he said, are going to be very impatient with us. They're going to impose a South African-type resolution, and then, this is a quote, Israel is finished.
Yes.
That's what he said. Israel is finished. One other thing, when you were giving your inventory of the parties, you only listed the secular parties. There's another opposition.
I didn't really list them,
because, Israel, they pay you, one thing you can say about Lieberman is he hates the Orthodox, and
Israel Beitenu is the secular party.
Yeah,
though.
yes, I'm saying it's a secular party, but there's Shas. There's also serious input.
You're absolutely right. I was
and
talking
that
about
has
the
to be
polls.
factored into it.
I agree with you completely. If you're looking at an overview of Israeli politics, that's a huge factor. And I think the future, if things are structured the way they are, the future lies with them.
With the ultra-Orthodox.
With the ultra-Orthodox, in the same way among Palestinians, nothing changes. The future lies with Hamas and the Muslim Brothers. I was just talking about the present cabinet, but it's a little different, yeah.
Okay.
I just had a question for Joel, because you said, I don't know how we're going to live with them, referring to the Israelis. I mean, first of all, the question is, you're not going to be the one that's going to have to live with them.
Palestinians say that, yeah.
Of course. Well, but then the question is, if you don't want the Palestinians expelled and you want peace and you're calling for this single state, doesn't that mean expelling the Jews then? I mean, if you don't know how you're going to live with them?
Well, that's a big problem that has to be worked out, you know, and I don't, I think, I want to repeat something and underscore what I said earlier, that certainly we should not minimize just how awful the situation has been, and, you know, but nobody in this room made it that way, you know, and we have to deal with it. And we can't predict the details of any future orientation. For instance, there's a significant likelihood, talk about polls, that said that as many as 15% of Israeli Jews say they would emigrate if the Palestinians come to power. They may have a very substantial minority. It's my impression, for instance, that the censuses that are taken now are understate overstate rather the number of Jews in Israel.
Oh, they do, and I'll tell you how. I'll tell you exactly how.
Here in Britain.
Yes, you're right. There are about 700,000 or so Jewish Israelis who are citizens, but who reside primarily somewhere else, and they're all counted. Whereas the Palestinians who live somewhere else, almost none of them are counted. So you're absolutely right.
And it's already happening. And I don't really know what will come of it, you know. I just know that it's a situation that inherently has a built-in momentum towards drastic change. Mm-hmm. It cannot stand, and so we have to think of the best possible ways of getting out of it. And at least we can recognize that and I say this in detail. The states should not be honored and respected. States come and go across the map of history and so on. Nobody need be harmed in the transition from one form of the state to the other. And I think personally that it would probably require a kind of protectorate of, you know, interested powers, including us and Turkey and others, that would guarantee the safety of the people who are there for an extended period of time until they can work out their peace and reconciliation process, which is something that we can learn from the South Africans. And that's going to take a long time, okay? But in that period, I think it's probably necessary that there be some international body that establishes a kind of protectorate to...
Isn't that what caused the problem in the first place?
Yeah, we'll be back to the
Palestinian
mandate.
Well, look, I mean, you have to be
mandate.
flexible and not hidebound.
Well, fair enough.
Okay, so mine's kind of following up. But, so I think both of you would agree and have argued that the conversation has broken down, the situation is dire, that it's far from a solution. My question is more of a historical. How do you understand this reached this point historically? And even further, where can we look now to find actual political solutions? And really my question is actually, where has the left been or is in all this?
Well, I'm going to leave the second one open a little bit because I think the which left, I mean, there's the Arab left, the Western left, is very complicated. But I want to focus more on the first part. How do we get here? Well, because the historical process, diplomatic process, has been completely mismanaged by all the parties, but I think particularly by the United States, to be honest with you. And I think that the way it's been structured hasn't understood the effect of the asymmetry of power between the two parties. It's politically almost impossible for Israeli leaders without proper international intervention to actually follow through on commitments made to Palestinians. I mean, because it is possible for them to renegotiate them, renege on them, or what have you, because they have the power to do it, because of the asymmetry of power. And this is something that hasn't been factored in properly. It would have made a lot more sense, and it may make a lot more sense in the future, rather than to go forward incrementally to an unknown future, to do something analogous to what happened at Dayton, where we have the framework of the agreement at the outset, and we negotiate backward to see how it's implemented. I think there's a much more reasonable approach to this, and I mean, Oslo was badly flawed from the beginning, first because it expected Israeli politicians to behave in a way that is politically untenable for them, given the asymmetry of power between the societies. In other words, actually make what they always talk about, painful concessions, right? That phrase, painful concession. But when it comes to it, it's very hard when you're facing an electorate that doesn't want to experience pain, to make them feel pain, when you can avoid that pain because you have all this power. So that's a key factor. Another, I think, well, let me just jump to the chase because time's getting late. One of the places I think you can really look for kind of hope at the moment is this state and institution building agenda. It's the Palestinian answer to the settlements. It's unilateral, it's constructive, it's serious, and if it is done in a sustained way over a period of years with financial support and technical support from around the world and political protection from the United States, it will change the strategic equation completely. It will reorient things, in my view. This is my opinion. And it's certainly a completely different approach than the Palestinian national movement has ever taken in the past. It's a way of asserting the responsibilities and adopting, without Israeli permission or anything, just simply doing it unilaterally, adopting the responsibilities of self-government. At the same time, you assert the right of self-determination. It's very powerful. I think it's something everyone who's serious about ending the occupation should be behind 100%.
I would just add to this that I cannot state strongly enough how important it is to organize in this country against the utterly destructive relationships that are set up between the U.S. and Israel, okay, and which are mediated by the so-called lobby. We can discuss that in great detail, but I would just leave you with that no time in history has there been a situation of this sort where a foreign country has been so protected and shielded by a great power. Never happened before in human history. And it runs directly contrary to the advice given by President George Washington when he took office and when he left office, saying, one thing I most counsel my American citizens to do is to avoid entangling relationships with foreign powers. Right? And we have a relationship with the state of Israel that is grotesque and cannot, how bizarre it is cannot be overstated, and except it can be changed. And and there's no excuse for just wringing your hands and saying, oh, it's too strong, or, too embedded, it's like changing the military-industrial complex. Well, all right, yes, it is like changing the military.
It is like that.
But it has to be done, and you might as well accept it. This is a responsibility that we have, because if we've changed that internal balance of power in this country, you're going to see very rapid and dramatic changes in Palestine.
Hi, I have a question for each. For Professor Kovel, it seems to me reasonable to ask if there's another example of a national movement, national liberation movement, any kind of national project which hasn't at some time or another verged on the kind of situation that hasn't defined itself sometimes ferociously against another. I can't think of one, frankly. Some have had the good luck to have such weak opponents that there hasn't been a lot of problem, and some have had enormous opponents and still haven't won against them. But I can't think of a national project that hasn't defined itself against another and hasn't at times had a situation not very different from that we see. Name one if you can. And the other question is, and to add to that, can you name, I could, but I'm supposed to be a question. Can you name small states?
Say, would it be correct to say?
There you go. Would it be correct to say that there have been other small nations which have happily collaborated with great powers for a greater length of time than, say, the last 45 years that Israel has with the U.S.? Okay, that's one question.
Okay.
And the second one is for Dr. Ibish, and that is, in a situation of great asymmetry, like the one that you have been pointing out, doesn't the weaker power sometimes have to find its strategy and even its objectives in the tactics that work rather than the other way around?
Yes.
So, for example, if Berlin has had some success, isn't there a suggestion there of a template or of some way, something that
Absolutely.
could be scalable? Those are my questions.
Can I do that? Because it's quick. It's going to be quick. Yes, of course. And I think nonviolent protest of the kind that is taking place there is really the ideal approach. The problem is that it's now, I think, impossible for the Palestinians to, I would argue, return to the Edenic period of the beginning of the first Intifada, where there was either nonviolent or just symbolic violence, like throwing rocks and whatever, not kill any Israeli soldier whatsoever. That period, and it was Gramscian, it was decentralized, it was localized, etc. By the end of the first Intifada, you had political parties returned to Palestine, right? Rival political parties, Fatah, the other PLO parties back on the ground in the West Bank. The Muslim Brotherhood had formed Hamas, and you had now not only competing political parties that were centralized, you also had armed militias. The problem with this scenario is that unless the political divisions among Palestinians were ended, and there was a national decision that was almost unanimous to adopt that strategy, which would be an effective one, undoubtedly, especially if it was coupled with sound diplomacy. But at the moment it's not available, because if you had that kind of action take place, it would, on a mass scale in the occupied territories, it would be met with violence from the Israeli military. I think there's no doubt it would be met with violence. And then, very quickly, armed factions of one side or another would respond with violence, and they would seize the momentum. In other words, I really just think we're beyond that stage in the conflict at the moment. And I say that with enormous regret. But I think that was an era of the past, I'm afraid. Now, I do think localized nonviolent struggles and other nonviolent resistance can take place. But when it hits the fan against the Israeli military in a major way, it's going to devolve to the political benefit of some armed group or another, and it's going to become an armed conflict again. And I'm afraid, I'm sorry to say that, but I mean, the essence and the kind of thrust of your question is very sound. It's just that the forces on the ground to produce that result that you look to are right now not present, and that's simply a reality we have to deal with.
Okay.
Now,
the question for you was...
in terms of I think you have to answer it concretely and not in the abstract. In the abstract, you can say, yeah, anything is possible. First of all, you want to differentiate between national liberation movements and settler colonial movements. This is a settler colonial situation, which is very important and relevant. Like the U.S., like South Africa, like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, it involves people coming in, taking over another country, and doing something with the natives. Now, here, a huge, you call it a mistake or a crime, whatever, was committed in that they chose a place that was singularly maladapted for that strategy. In that, and I'm not praising, I think what the United States did with our indigenous population, Canada too, is unconscionable, has deeply scarred our nation. I've written a book about this and so on. I know all about it. But it's not the same. We had a big frontier, and we pushed these indigenous people back and into reservations, and they were forgotten, and it was horrible. Okay. But nothing of the sort has happened as what's happened in Palestine, where they take over a land that is surrounded by hundreds of millions of confreres of the people that they're expropriating. And there can never, ever be any kind of equilibrium under those circumstances, and they must instead be constantly leaning upon the imperial power, and which suits them just fine, but aggravates all of the destructive, aggressive, and nihilistic tendencies that are built in. So you're getting a settler colonial situation that is peculiarly malignant and self-imploding. So I think that's the real difference. That's why I think it's important to say that Zionism is a bad idea. It was a big mistake, and we should get over it.
Howard, you've been waiting a long time.
I want to say hello to all three of you from Evanston, Hudson, and Washington.
I just want to say this is going to be the last question. It's 9:10. We have to.
I'm just getting warmed
How
up.
about go through the
We
the people
promise
who
to
are
be.
standing
Let me
up?
promise to be
No?
really quick.
Three questions.
Three questions really
All right,
quick.
we'll take those
Well,
last
there are
three
four people
There's
standing,
four people.
so.
Why doesn't everybody ask the question and then we'll... Okay, wait. So everyone's going to ask a question.
And then we won't deal with it
the
all.
speakers
but
will
you'll have
respond,
express
and then
yourself.
we'll
I'm
adjourn.
going to mention an
That's only
article
fair.
by Jonathan Kutab, a human rights lawyer and activist from Palestine, December 20th in the Los Angeles Times. His article is Steps to Create an Israel-Palestine, a one-state solution in the area is not as far-fetched as it might seem. Now what he says that Israel's in control of the territory and it seems unwilling to relinquish a significant part or to consider the possibility, and it seems that this one state will continue, and in continuing that with the birth rate much higher of Palestinians, that it's time for Israelis to start considering what they can do so that they won't be overpowered. And he says there are various things that the Israelis can do. They can figure out a bicameral legislature.
Sorry, do you have a question?
A bicameral legislature, constitutional guarantees,
Right.
other steps. And then he says that they should refashion Zionism. Now, I don't know, Joel apparently thinks that Zionism can't be refashioned, but
All right.
in
Do you
my,
have
in
a
my
question?
study of Zionism, I've been very inspired by people like Judah Magnus, Martin Buber,
Yeah.
and those portions of Zionism that were defeated by the other brands of Zionism. Now, couldn't we try to bring back some of those strands of Zionism? Not all of Zionism acted the way the people who are acting now wanted. Let's try to refashion them and refocus Zionism and do some of these steps so that the Jewish people wouldn't be overpowered once the Palestinians have a greater population.
Thank you, Howard.
Wouldn't it be possible to work together, including Americans and others, to fashion a one state that would really work? And there'd be all kinds of different varieties of a one state. A condominium,
Do you have a question?
confederation.
No. Yeah,
What do you think about what Kutab was saying?
Okay.
It's been
Okay,
2 minutes.
There we go.
And both of
It's
you,
been 2
you
minutes.
know?
Okay, Howard. We'll let everybody speak, though, and then we'll have...
Okay, well,
I had a longer question, but I forgot it. So I'll just ask two shorter ones.
Yeah.
The first to Dr. Kovel.
Yes.
You associate Zionism explicitly with the Jewish religion and suggest that overcoming, or rather, let's turn the question around. And for you, does overcoming Zionism mean overcoming Judaism itself, indeed religion as such? And for Dr. Ibish?
Yes.
You mentioned at the end of your presentation about the new forms of class stratification
Yes.
within Gaza. I'm asking, what specifically do you see might be a relationship between class stratification and the specific turn towards religious Islam?
Yes.
In other words, how can we explain the rise of religious fundamentalism, not as a revival simply as a traditional way of life, but rather as a distinctly
Political
modern
movement,
types
yeah.
of politics rooted in
absolutely.
capitalist modernity?
Yeah, absolutely.
Neil?
My question is, what do you think of what I'm going to say?
Okay.
Which is fairly brief.
Am I correct?
We have 1
Nicely done, Neil.
So this is a challenge to the whole debate here, which is very interesting. I didn't hear the whole thing, but it's a very interesting debate. However, for those of us who are Americans, American citizens living here, it's not our business to take a side in this debate. One state, two states, because it's a form of American interference. It's up to the people there to decide.
Yeah.
We as Americans should take the stand to get the hell out of that area, to stop all the aid that's going there that props up the state of Israel and its occupation. We should end this imperialist attitude and not take a stand ourselves in this debate. That's up to the people there.
Okay.
Nice and brief.
Yeah, it was.
Good. How's it going? My question is for Dr. Kovel. In your speech,
speak louder.
Please.
Yeah.
My question for Dr. Kovel.
Much better.
My question was, in your speech, you talked a lot about nationalism and on a very theoretical basis and stuff. And you said that maybe a lot of the problem arises from these national sentiments. That if they didn't exist, there wouldn't be really a conflict. I was just thinking, a lot of professors like Professor Mearsheimer at the school think that if anything, Mearsheimer's nationalism is on the rise.
Well, I'm sorry, I just didn't hear what you
What about the idea that nationalism is on the rise, as Mearsheimer would argue?
Yeah.
On the rise. Oh, yeah.
And I was just wondering, do you see any trends toward the opposite, such that maybe a solution might come about from a decrease in national sentiments and so forth? That was my question.
Good.
Thank you.
At last.
You have the floor.
This is for Professor Hussein.
Oh, yes.
Just making sure that you said that the PLO and the Palestinian people, they seem to want peace, right? And it's by the PLO.
Right.
But can you really say that it is the national goal of the Palestinian people to make peace when the U.S. set it up to be the PLO is in power instead of Hamas?
Good question. Very good question.
Okay, so how do we proceed?
I don't know. Do you want to make a series of statements, and then I'll make a series of statements, and we're done?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. And,
all right.
Let
me
go
through. Yeah. Oh, no, you go right. No, absolutely. Please.
After you. All right. I'll be fast. No, you have to be just as fast. Howard, that's great. I mean, of course we should work together, and but and as well as I do what we're up against. You have to, the obdurate institutions of the IDF and the American military-industrial complex and imperialism and all those things. But you're right, and we should all get together. I think we have not by any means exhausted the degree of international cooperation on this issue. Sometimes I thought there should be 3 international congresses, one of Israelis and Palestinians, and then everybody else, and we should meet every year and try to work out. That's fine. And it's perfectly the case. I, by the way, would counsel against any kind of uncritical acceptance of Martin Buber. As you know, if you read my book, and quoting Uri Davis, Buber took over Said's home in Palestine, and shortly afterwards said that he no longer questioned the fundamentals of the Israeli state. Okay, he actually. But Magnus died, unfortunately. He was. Okay. No. Okay, that's point one. The young man about Zionism. Yes, World Enough in Time. Huge question. Zionism is by no means simply a Jewish movement. Christian Zionism is extremely important. This nation was founded by people who thought of themselves as the 13th tribe of Israel and wanted to build a Hebraic state. And this is quote from the Puritan fathers and so on and so forth. And so we just haven't gotten into it. It's terribly important.
And I just want to interject. I think that what Howard is speaking about are traditions of cultural Zionism or binational state Zionism.
Yeah. That's fine, but you have to deal with the IDF first. Okay. And overcoming Judaism, too big a question. I can't answer it. I think that I think it is. There's a kind of a facile statement which we easily make, namely, oh, this is, Judaism is not inherently Zionism. We know that. But on the other hand, Zionism did grow out of strong currents within Judaism. And we have to have a better reckoning with that. And I'm not going to make it right now. I think we should be prepared to do what Marx said, ruthless criticism of everything existing should be our goal. And everything existing includes Judaism. We should have ruthless criticism.
And what about Neil's question about we shouldn't get involved in this debate about one state, two state? We should just oppose U.S. policy.
I was coming to that.
And that the U.S. can only play a negative role.
I think it's great. Look, if all that comes out of this is the U.S. says, we're out of here, I'll say, hurrah. Although it's going to be terrible because there'll be huge bloodbaths.
Yeah, I will not be saying
hurrah. Terrible, terrible bloodbaths.
So you'll say hurrah,
because I do think, no, I would say that, but then I'd back away from it. Because what I said before was you're going to need a protectorate. You're going to need some kind of great power intervention to avoid the terrible retributions that would happen if you just backed away. Okay, you just
that
can't
we
do
agree.
There's no question about that.
On the
other hand, I think there has to be some kind of phasic withdrawal of U.S. support of Israel. It's interesting that even a very, very tepid debate took place in New York recently about resolve that the U.S. should fundamentally rethink its relationship to Israel. Tepid in that none of these issues that we talked about here were raised. It was all within the framework of, that one. Khalidi and Eisenstadt.
Yeah, I know what it was.
It was dreadful, I thought. But on the other hand, the eyes won. The audience was shifted, saying yes, we should rethink our fundamental relationship. In that sense, we should. And there should be a. What Eisenhower did. After Suez, he sat them down and said, "Listen, guys, you've got to change, or we're gonna make you pay for it." And they changed. And so we can do that. And I'm not so sure nationalism is on the rise. Nationalism that's the next question, takes tremendous numbers of different forms. I think the high water mark of nationalism was early in most of the 19th century. Okay. I think what you now have is a series of defensive nationalisms against the homogenization of global capital that de-differentiates people. And so you have the kind of resistances against that, which include also fundamentalist religions and the like, with people trying to preserve community against the inroads of the capitalist deterritorialization, which is such a powerful force in the world. I think that doesn't necessarily conduce to nationalism. Or from another angle, the nationalist part can be sublimated, if you like, in international sporting events and things of that sort. I think that the kind of deep malignant nationalisms that eventuated in Nazism, for instance, are indeed things of the past.
Boy, I wish I believed that.
Well, okay, we have another whole debate. I'd be very pleased to debate that question.
Yeah, me too. I'd win.
No, you wouldn't. No. I don't think that's the case at all. I think you have to look upon human society as in a state of evolution, and different forms of organization and association and belief emerge now in different conditions. But we're not going to get into that.
Did you have more?
No, that's it.
Okay. All right. I just begin by saying I really wish I agreed about nationalism, but boy, just look, the Balkans, Rwanda, Congo, Middle East, it's just all over the world. I don't see any evidence for this at all, and I wouldn't qualify it all as sort of defensive nationalism responding to global capital. I think there's a lot more at work than that, which takes me directly to the question about fundamentalism and Islamism among the Palestinians. It's linked to a broader conflict within the Arab world and the Islamic world generally, between mainstream societies and insurgent Islamist groups. I don't think this is a function of that much external pressures. I mean, certainly both the West and the Arab regimes have promoted fundamentalism and Islamist groups in a way that's been very damaging. But I think the dynamics are extremely complex, and they have to do with they're strongly linked to the colonial experience and the post-colonial experience. There's no question. But I don't think it's a response to capitalism. I think it's a response to a lot of other stresses. And, I just don't want to go further than that because it's a huge question. And, I'm not sure exactly where you want the question to go, but I'll leave it at that. No, I'm not talking to you, the guy behind you. I'm coming to last. To you, Howard, I understand what you're saying. I read Kutab's piece with great interest. I think there was a lot of merit in it. My reservations about the single state as an objective of activists, I've made clear, I think, throughout my talk, but I'll just add one more thing, which I think neither Kutab mentioned, or two quick things about Kutab. One thing about him and one thing he didn't mention. One thing about him is that his article was very close to the way that this argument is deployed in the occupied territories by Palestinians there, as opposed to the diaspora thing, where it's really kind of a threat. It's a kind of a device to induce greater seriousness by Israel towards ending the occupation, which is the overwhelming goal in the occupied territories. And there's a real tension between the way it's deployed by people, not so much by Kutab, but by Sari al-Nusaybi, by Saad Barakat, by Abu Allat, by people like that, by most of the people in the occupied territories.
What did you think of Michael Tarazi?
Who do it? Tarazi is part of the diasporic thing, but it's not clear at all what he thinks now. And at the time, it was a trial balloon, and so Tarazi is he's part and parcel of that threat matrix, and I did mention it. In fact, the whole section in my book about the one-state solution as strategic threat and inducement begins with Tarazi, because he was employed by the PLO as an attorney at the time he made that argument. So they were clearly, and the Palestine Study Group and on and on and on. So it's used in a very different way. Now the problem with it, the one problem I didn't mention that I really want to, is that the one-state arguments give Israel a pass on the two things it can't defend, the occupation and the settlements. And it gives them a pass because once you've accepted the single-state argument, the occupation isn't an occupation anymore. I mean, the only basis for calling it an occupation is 242. Right? And also, if this is going to be a single country, then it is not an occupation. And the settlements, again, are not, it gives them a pass in both ways. First, because if this is going to be a single state, the argument about where people are living is a minor matter, and it might be a question of lawsuits about misappropriated land, but it's certainly not a contravention of the Geneva Convention and a massive human rights violation, all the things we say it is. It's some minor matter, and it becomes something much more mundane. It's something that happens in a lot of states. That's really problematic. The other thing is, of course, from the Jewish-Israeli point of view, it plays right into the hands of the right wing, who say, see, well, they do not want an Israel. They're trying to get rid of us. So the whole occupation is legitimate and defensive, and the settlements are legitimate and defensive because what's coming at us is a negation of our national identity. This is politically, it's highly unwise from a Palestinian point of view that focuses on ending the occupation, but in both directions. Now, the question, I think the last one that was aimed at me was the lady's question, right?
Well, also the question about U.S. policy and the U.S. getting out of the Middle East.
Yeah, okay, fine, I'll deal with that too. Yeah, I sort of agree with Professor Kovel. I think we envisage it a little differently, but I do definitely think the parties left on their own is going to produce an unhappy result. There's too much asymmetry, too much bad blood, too much anger, and I like his idea of an international presence. I think it makes much more sense in the context of a two-state arrangement, where you have international presence dividing the states providing security and whatnot in the transition to a healthy relationship between two states, and then, hopefully in some generations, a confederation, merger, or whatever. That's a very different scenario, and I think that's a reasonable one. But I think U.S. diplomatic role is crucial if we're not unless we're going to give up on the idea of a negotiated agreement, because I think terribly bloody religious war is the only serious, plausible alternative to a negotiated agreement. Of course, I don't want to see that happen. And if I had 20 minutes, I'd explain to you the ways in which I think it is possible for the Palestinians to leverage the special relationship with the United States to their benefit at times in certain ways if they do it intelligently, but I don't have that. So I do think it's possible, and I don't think, at any rate, this is the reality they have to deal with. Palestinians cannot wait for American political structure to change in 20, 30, 40 years. They cannot wait for generalized attitudes to change. They cannot wait for Israel to de-Zionize itself. They cannot wait for anything. The occupation has to end now. All right, and they can't wait for it. So everything else has to be, I think, subordinated to that aim. It is the overarching aim. Other things can be dealt with later. The occupation cannot be postponed. Final question, the lady's question. I can't agree with your premise that the United States has decreed the PLO to be in charge of the Palestinians. We had a situation for many decades in which the PLO was absolutely unchallenged. And in fact, still to this day, by every known legal definition and Palestinian, Arab, or international document, the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people at the national level, meaning at the level of diplomacy, is the PLO. Now, even Hamas agrees with that. Hamas's position is that, yeah, the PLO is authorized to negotiate with Israel and conduct all Palestinian diplomacy. But they say the PLO is an anachronism and it needs to be reshaped, meaning taken over by them. Okay. Hold on.
I had a factual question. You should explain to people the distinction between the PA and the PLO, because I think
unfortunately,
okay.
I mean, yeah, unfortunately we are out of time.
Well, but can I not finish that question?
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, just let me answer the lady's question. I mean, it's the final thing I'm going to say, which is, yeah. I mean, okay, the PLO and the PA are not the same. The PLO is the governing body, diplomatic national body of the Palestinian. PA is the government in the occupied territories. You have two elections following the death of Arafat. One that was won by Fatah, the presidential election, a 63% vote for Mahmoud Abbas. A parliamentary election, 1 year later, 44% victory for Hamas-backed candidates. So you've had a situation in which the PLO is being challenged, and Fatah, the constituent groups within the PLO, they're challenged at the level of national leadership by Hamas. But as I said, their status as the diplomatic arm of the Palestinian people is not challenged. And I think further, if you look at opinion polls, Hamas, that election came at the moment of maximum popularity for Hamas. And they've been in free fall ever since, and in spite of the battering that Fatah and other PLO parties have taken in the last 6 to 8 months, some of it self-inflicted, largely externally inflicted, it weirdly hasn't redounded to the benefit of Hamas. The last poll was a dramatic one. It was last week. 48% of Palestinians in favor of Fatah and the PLO, 13% in favor of Hamas, 38% didn't like anybody, which is pretty sound. So what I'm trying to tell you is that while there is certainly a contest for national power in Palestine, the momentum among Palestinians is still with the secular nationalists ultimately, and with the PLO, and definitely away from Hamas. And more, I think that there isn't any serious challenge to the role of the PLO as the diplomatic and national arm of the Palestinian people. As I said, even Hamas recognizes it; they just want it restructured. So there's my answer to you.
All right, and
Thank you. I have a few copies of this book if anybody wants.
I'd like to thank Joel Kovel for joining me today, for being willing to.
I'd like to thank both.
You were the first one to agree.
On behalf of the Platypus Affiliated Society, I'd like to thank both our panelists, Hussein Ibish and Joel Kovel. If you'd like to continue the conversation, we'll be having a coffee break tomorrow at 4:30 in Harper Commons on the 3rd floor of Harper. On Thursday, we will be having a screening of the movie Finally Got the News at 6:30 in Harper 102 in our Politics of Black History series. And on Friday, there will be a teach-in at the on the conflict at 3 o'clock in Bartlett Lounge. Thanks for coming, everyone.